Hey, what's up? This is Caleb 9000. Today we're going to be starting our first discography review. We're going to start with Death, and obviously that's going to be with the debut album of theirs from 1987, Scream Bloody Gore. Scream Bloody Gore is sometimes looked at as the first death metal album. I mean, obviously that's not true because Possessed beat them to it, but in many ways, Death took what Possessed did and pulled it further away from thrash. I guess you could say that it's best heard on the song Baptized in Blood or whatever because it's the fastest song on the album. Not only that, because it has more chromatic riffing in it than the other songs on the album. And but even then again, you've got some more melodic tracks like Torn to Pieces or Evil Dead, especially Evil Dead. Um but nevertheless, it's a pretty historically important album, even if some people might call into question whether or not it's the best Death album or not. So, this was before they moved to Florida and they got Scott Burns as a producer. So, the production on here is a bit muddier, uh, and it's also a bit more bass driven, but it fits the tone of the music because Scream Bloody Gore is easily their most raw and gritty album. Uh, Speaking of more raw, Chuck's vocals are at their most unintelligible on here. Uh, Oftentimes, Chuck is usually looked at as one of the better death metal vocalists by people who aren't really into the genre because you can tell what he's saying, but here, not so much. Even though he still has the kind of wailing retard kind of growling that was mostly around in the 80s, uh, he was still a bit deeper than most vocalists going on at the time. Every now and then he'll let out a random scream, and it's usually pretty effective when he does it. Um, my personal favorite songs, one of which is the opener, Infernal Death, because it has a really cool kind of doomy opening before it goes into a sort of bouncy thrash riff, but the fast double bass drumming makes up for that. Um, it's one of the more energetic songs on the album. It's probably the thrashiest song on the album too. Even though it's one of the least dynamic songs, it's really straightforward and to the point, and that riff is edged into your brain from the first moment you hear it. Doom 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 doom. Another is Zombie Ritual, of course. I mean, I personally think this song is a little bit overrated, but that's only because most people say it's the best song on the album, and it's not quite my favorite. It starts off with a cool Phrygian scale riff in the opening that everyone knows before it gets really fast, and this is probably the most dynamic song on the album. It's got quite a few tempo changes, even though the verse chorus structure is still there. Then again, Death always kind of had that. And it has one of the more melodic, but also one of the more infectious solos on the album. I like how the bridge starts off with a sort of tension building thing before it goes into more almost mid pace double bass. I thought that was cool, and there's a few key changes in this song. Every riff is great, just a fantastic track all in all. Um, Mutilation. This is probably the most. It was the one that was the hardest to get into because it has kind of a weird chorus with just weird vocal syncopation and overall drumming that sometimes just doesn't even go into a beat so much as it patters all over the place. But at first it sounds sloppy, but it's actually done this way on purpose. Even though the album is sloppy in certain places, but and again, extreme metal isn't usually a genre that's known for being all that technically proficient, unless it's like tech death or whatever, which Death isn't, or at least they weren't yet. Um, Baptized in Blood is probably the most underrated. Like I said, it's probably the most. It holds up the most out of all the other songs, mostly because it's one of the first songs I've heard to have double bass drumming that accents the snare on the very first beat. So instead of it's kind of like what Napalm Death was doing at the time, only not quite as blindingly fast. Evil Dead, of course, because of that beautiful intro. It was one of the first things I ever learned to play on guitar, and I still love playing it to this day. So yeah, I can't really say it. It's probably the most atmospheric song on the album too. So like, if you're not into death metal and you're more into black metal or whatever, that's probably something that you'd more be into. Then again, if you're already into black metal, I don't really see how you wouldn't have heard this album. But there's always an exception. So there is some, despite the muddy production and overall primitive nature of the album, if there's one thing that makes this album a little bit more accessible to some people who are getting into death metal, is that there's still a hint of thrash, and there's still a hint of melody here and there, even if it's not a very strong one, and it has a greater emphasis on catchiness than the rest of them. Not to say that you're going to like this album the first time you hear it. I didn't the first time I heard it. It all just kind of went over my head. But eventually, once I actually started to learn to get into extreme metal, I started to like it. Yeah, these riffs are all usually interesting, even if they're kind of basic. And they're straightforward and they're to the point, but they stick with you. That's not really something you can say with all music that's as basic as this. One thing that Scream Bloody Gore does get some flack for in retrospect is that there isn't all that much to it when compared to stuff like this. It doesn't have anything that's super special about it. But I don't really think that's a fair thing to say, considering it's one of the first death metal albums, so it's more of a building block for what the genre does today, so it should be looked at for its time. So, calling the album generic by today's standards, I think, should be excused. Most of the songs on here are great. The lyrics are mostly fantastical Gore lyrics and stuff like that, but most of the time they're not that bad. I've read better Gore lyrics from bands like Carcass and Cryptopsy and stuff like that, but these lyrics aren't that bad, although they are pretty ridiculous sometimes, especially on the song Sacrificial, where he says, "Watch you bleed to death, gasping for last breath, choking on your blood, I shit onto your guts." I laughed out loud the first time I heard that. Chuck's known for being a really good lyricist, but that wasn't one of his strong points. But overall, this is a fantastic album. I'd give it a 93 out of 100. It's something that you should definitely listen to. It's practically a death metal starter pack album in and of itself. Not quite as much as the next album, Leprosy, but we'll talk about that one in the next video. Until then, thank you all for watching this video. This is Caleb 9000 signing off. Goodbye, viewers. Over and out. High five!